This week in Weekly Space News, the rough and turbulent history of the Novato meteorite has been revealed by scientists. The supernova type 1a in January this year was probably caused by two white dwarfs collapsing into each other, and Venus and Jupiter really close together. How is that possible? In this week's questions, an answer about the lunar eclipse, about Pluto, and about meteor showers. And this week's place to visit, the beautiful rings of Saturn. This is Weekly Space News. Hello everyone, this is Frostbreath reporting and welcome back to Space News, the third episode already, and thank you so much for all of the questions of last week. I'll be certain to answer all of them later on in this episode, but first things first, the big news of this week. You may have noticed that there's no short news because there wasn't much to talk about when I tried to search for interesting news that everybody could understand and without all the physical chemistry words and terms that nobody would understand, and even I had trouble understanding them. So here's a few interesting headlines from the news as heard in the intro. First of all, the very rough and turbulent history of the meteorite Novato, as I am personally nicknaming it. A while ago, actually on 17 October 2012, a meteorite crashed on the roof of a house in Novato, California in the USA. Now, first of all, that's quite a shock for the people living in that house. But secondly, scientists have done an extensive research on that meteorite. Now, to understand how meteorites actually manage to crash into the Earth, they need to have an orbit that actually passes within the orbit of planet Earth. Now, I found this asteroid meteorite, which is named Apophis, which is quite a big one. And they call it a NEO, a near-Earth object. And there's many of them. And if we zoom out, and the red line will be the orbit of Apophis. And you need to find the orbit of Earth, obviously, which is over there. If you see my cursor, the third ring around the Sun. And you can see that Apophis actually passes the orbit of planet Earth twice during its orbit. Its rotation, its orbital period is slightly shorter than Earth. It's 323 days. So, yeah, this is a near-Earth object, and it's a potential threat. But don't worry, because it rarely ever passes close enough to the Earth to actually risk impact. They think the chance of impact is less than 0.001%. So I shouldn't worry about that. That should be totally fine. But when it does happen, it's quite the sight. Maybe you remember the news of last year about the meteorite crashing into Russia, which fortunately many people caught on video. And this comet Novato, it's a meteorite, not a comet. This meteorite Novato crashed into California on the 17th of October. The photo you see here is some kind of a slideshow. It's not like there's that many fragments, but you can view it from the left to right or right to left. I'm not entirely sure, but you can see what kind of spectacular sight that should have been. Now they have researched the history of this meteorite, and it appears that this piece of rock has probably come to life, quote unquote, during the birth of the moon. Now let's actually go to Earth. Because, and turn off the orbits, that would be nice. Because the moon has not always been around. In fact, they think the moon came into existence after an object crashed into planet Earth that was the size of Mars during the birth of the entire solar system. That impact got so much loose rock into space that it actually formed a ring around planet Earth, which later, due to gravitational influence, because that's how gravity works, turned into this giant ball called the moon. And we all know that the moon keeps things in check here, makes sure that the Earth doesn't rotate kind of weirdly. It causes the floods every day, and it causes quite a beautiful sight, of course. But that piece of rock existed came into existence during that crash of that object with planet Earth, and then had a very rough history because it has crashed many more times. And then finally it crashed into California. Whoa. And then onto the roof of a house. So that's like a 4 billion year old rock, which is amazingly old, and it's kind of fascinating that scientists have been able to reveal the history of such a tiny piece of rock. Second piece of this news of this week was actually a supernova. And if you've ever heard of a supernova, it's actually a giant explosion in space. Usually supernovas happen when an old star dies, an old giant star I should actually say. So stars like red or blue supergiants, which are really huge and come to the end of their life. When all of their fuel is burned, they'll explode from the inside out and turn into a neutron star or a black hole. However, there's also a different kind of supernova, which is actually caused by a white dwarf. Now that is first of all kind of strange, because a white dwarf is actually already the end of life stage of a red giant, which was formerly a yellow dwarf, like our own sun. However, white dwarfs can cause a supernova when they actually get too heavy, and that is kind of weird. How does that even happen? Well, a white dwarf quite often has a very close neighbor star, which it probably orbits, or that neighbor star orbits the white dwarf. It's often a much bigger star than the white dwarf itself, and because of this tiny star gravity, it will start sucking up material from its neighbor star, and it will start sucking up more and more and more. It will become heavier and heavier until the star itself can no longer sustain the weight it has sucked up and completely collapses, exploding into a supernova of the so-called type 1a. However, the supernova type 1a in January this year, scientists discovered, was not caused by this kind of action. It was caused by two white dwarfs crashing into each other, which also calls apparently a supernova of this type. It's kind of a new discovery for scientists, and they were quite flabbergasted by it. So and they may eventually rename it to a new type of supernova, but for now they call it the supernova type 1a, which is caused by a white dwarf. Now, if you've had a bright sky this morning at around 6 AM on August 18th, you may have seen something very strange and unusual. The planet Venus and Jupiter were extremely close together in the early morning sky, as seen in Stellarium over here. They were so close together that both names are actually inside each other, so we need to zoom in a little bit. Venus and Jupiter, two of the most bright objects in the night sky, after the moon of course, were incredibly close together, which will obviously raise a question: how is that even possible? How is it possible that the planet that is second closest to the Sun is so close to the fifth planet in the solar system, Jupiter? Well, for that to explain, we need to go back to Space Engine. Now here you may actually understand slightly better how it works. These are all the orbits of the 5 planets that are nearest to the Sun. First of all, you have Mercury, followed by Venus, Earth, Mars and Jupiter. Now, to understand how these planets are actually so close together, because you can see there's a huge distance between the two planets, you have to look at Earth points of view. Imagine you would stand on this spot on the Earth and you would look, just draw an imaginary line, to planet Venus. It would appear as if Jupiter was right beside it, because its orbit makes it very close, from our point of view, to the planet Venus, while in fact they are still millions and millions and millions of kilometers apart from each other. So that is quite the unique sight and doesn't happen really often. The next time that such a close approach of two objects happens is on August 31st, where the Moon and Saturn will get really close together. Let's actually check that out in Stellarium. Now this one is probably harder to see, because on August 31st at around 9:45 PM in the evening, local time, you'll see that Saturn, the Moon and also planet Mars are pretty close together in the night sky, but they're really low above the horizon in the west. You can see that the Moon and Saturn, from our point of view, are really close together, while in fact they are of course millions and billions kilometers apart. What is even more interesting is that if you live in the southeast of the United States, Saturn will actually be covered by the moon, which is even more of an amazing and very, very rare sight. I personally will not be able to see it because it does not happen in Europe, but if you live in the southeast of the United States, you'll see that the moon goes over Saturn. Alright, then for this week's, or actually last week's questions, I received 3 questions, which is quite amazing. Thank you for actually asking these questions, and I'll try to answer them to the best of my abilities. First question is actually why, when there's a lunar eclipse, does the moon go red? There isn't any red in the Earth's atmosphere, so where does the color come from? This question was actually asked by Kakperutka26. Thank you very much for that question, and here's your answer. A lunar eclipse is when the moon goes behind the Earth in such a position that it will be covered by the Earth's shadow. It happens like once or maybe even twice a year, so it's quite a rare thing. A little less rare than the solar eclipse, but it's still an amazing sight to see. But then there's quite a huge difference. When the moon goes in front of the sun during a solar eclipse, the sun gets completely covered and it turns dark. However, when the moon goes behind the Earth, it doesn't get covered completely in the Earth's shadow. Well, in fact it does, but it does not completely turn black. How is that possible? That is because of the Earth's atmosphere. It's actually quite simple, because if you look at the sun when it's going down or up, you'll see that the sun is not really yellowish or whitish like it should be. It's red, or when it's slightly higher above the horizon, it's orange. That has everything to do with the Earth's atmosphere. You can see a perfect example here. Let's actually land somewhere over here and make the sun go down. Speed up time a little bit. You can see the moon over there, quite coincidentally. See what happens when the sun goes down. It will change color due to the gases that are actually in the atmosphere. It will turn orange, turn red, and then goes below the horizon. Oh, there we had a nice, very nice sight. Over there you can see the sun in a perfectly red color. Well, it's actually a yellow dwarf. The moon itself reflects the white yellowish color of the sun and therefore appears as a very bright white object in the night sky. But when there is a lunar eclipse, it turns red because of the atmosphere of the sun. I mean of the Earth. Wow, that's really such a nice mistake of me over there. But that's kind of strange because it should be like this, completely covered black. It doesn't, because in fact a little bit of light, red light from the Earth's atmosphere goes just past onwards to the moon. And if I get this really close, you can see that it's actually red light. And that is what happens. This red light is actually redirected to the moon, and the moon reflects this kind of strange red light, which is why it kind of appears red when there is a total and full lunar eclipse. It will not be covered by the Earth's shadow, complete darkness, because the Earth has an atmosphere. The moon doesn't, so the sun doesn't change color. The Earth does, so the moon does change color. I hope that answers your question. The second question comes from the same user, thank you very much, and that is actually a question about the personal opinion of mine. Do you yourself consider Pluto as a planet or a dwarf planet? Well, I'll actually first pay a little visit to our cute little dwarf planet Pluto. In 1930, Clyde Tombaugh was actually searching for the so-called planet X, a planet that actually had an influence on the orbit of Neptune, and he manages to find it, and he named it Pluto, after the Roman god of the underworld, not the dog from Mickey Mouse. At that time it was considered the 9th planet, but as the years passed, in 2006, scientists decided to redefine the criteria for an object to be a planet, because there were many more objects to be discovered that were the size of Pluto, really small, and very, very far from the sun. However, there were a few anomalies with these planets. First of all, like Pluto, all of these planets had a strange orbit. Pluto itself sometimes comes even closer to the sun than Neptune does. Its orbit brings it closer to the sun. Well, let's actually activate the orbit of Pluto and turn it on. I should actually do it right over here and tick on the dwarf planet orbit. Zoom out a lot because it's very far away. You'll see that the orbit of Pluto is very strange. It goes up and down, and sometimes it passes within the orbit of Neptune. It's kind of hard to see, but it happens some kind of over here. There you had it, I think. No, that's not where it is. Well, either way, it does get closer to Neptune than... I mean, it does get closer to the Sun than Neptune does sometimes. Secondly, it's a very, very small object, which means if that were Pluto were to be a planet, all of these newly discovered objects also would have been planets, making the solar system having a total of like 13 planets, and that is where a line had to be drawn. A third criteria was that Pluto did not completely clean up its orbit like all of the 8 other planets did. So, since it did not fulfill those 3 criteria, a normal orbit, a decent size, and a clean orbit, they decided to make a new category of planets called the dwarf planets, in which Pluto currently resides, along with many others like Ceres, which is in between Mars and Jupiter, Haumea, Makemake, and Eris. They're all very small objects with strange orbits, not clean orbits, making them all dwarf planets. Now, my personal opinion, yeah, that's kind of hard to say, because as a scientist, kind of a scientist, I'm not a professional scientist, I'm just one of them, amateur astronomers, I would say Pluto would indeed be a dwarf planet because it does not meet these criteria. Of course, there's many people actually that their own emotions come into play and their own opinion, and they say that Pluto should still be a planet because it's really mean of those scientists, because that's what they kind of say, to demote this little baby to a dwarf planet. But in my opinion, it is as much as a dwarf planet as any of the other objects because of those criteria. And the last question of this, last week, is how come the meteor showers happen at the same time every year? If they're clumps of rocks or something along those lines that burn up in the atmosphere, how do they continue to show up at the same time every year? Won't they eventually stop appearing? Now that is a very good question, and I can imagine that some people are quite confused about this. But you must understand first of all that they are being fed. In fact, they have a parent body. As a comet passes the orbit of Earth, they leave behind a trail of dust and very tiny rocks, or sometimes it's actually an asteroid who leaves behind those tiny rocks. What happens then is that the Earth passes through this trail, which also orbits the Sun, causing those meteor showers to happen. And as this trail continues to orbit, a fresh batch of tiny rock and pieces of dust is being delivered around Earth's orbit every year. And when the comet returns, it will be completely refreshed along the entire orbit. So I hope that answers your questions, that comets and other tiny bodies refresh the stream of dust and tiny rocks. Saturn, the place to visit this week. It may just be quite visible from the night sky, you would have to look that up on your own. But this is planet Saturn, considered to be the most beautiful planet of the entire solar system, and I would totally agree. It makes it so beautiful because of those huge rings over here, you can see them. But what makes them so special is their enormous size. You can even see them from planet Earth through a quite small telescope, which is quite amazing because all of the 4 gas giants have rings, but only those of Saturn are visible with a telescope from planet Earth. Now they look like they're solid rings which you could actually grab with both hands and lift them away from Saturn, but in fact they are not. They consist of very small pieces of rock, which becomes quite a bit more clear if I fly close enough to these rings. You can see over here that they are not solid. They're made of very small pieces of rock, ranging from, well, probably a few centimeters to a few kilometers. How are they actually kept in check? How do they not crash into Saturn? Because it looks like they may just go into Saturn and crash in there, but that has everything to do with the gravity. Just like the moon orbits our own planet, and the many moons of Saturn orbit their mother planet, so do the rings. They're all kept in check by gravity, and in fact, they're also kept in check by these tiny little moons over here, which are called shepherd moons. They keep the rings in check. They divide the different rings. For example, this one over here, which is named Pan, a very simple name, Pan. As you can see, the orbit it is in leaves a gap between the outer ring of Saturn and the inner rings. And there's, if I'm correct, another shepherd moon. Let's see if we can find it, or if it's probably so small that we can't even see it. There should be at least 2 shepherd moons. This one, I would consider another shepherd moon, Prometheus, which makes sure the rings are kept on the outside. And that is how the beautiful rings of Saturn are actually there. Now you may wonder, how did these rings come into existence? Well, they are not sure. They probably think that this happened due to a huge collision between 2 moons that smashed them apart, turning them into thousands of pieces of millions of pieces of rock, and which then caused these massive rings around Saturn. Quite amazing. Well, that's it for this week's episode. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope I answered your questions correctly, and I hope you understood everything I said. Thanks a lot for watching. Make sure to leave new questions. Maybe you can suggest a place to visit yourself. Maybe you have suggestions or feedback you want to give me about these series. Just keep them coming. I appreciate everything. Thanks for watching, and see you next week.